Chapter 5 of Famous Sea Fights by John R. Hale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Leeson. Famous Sea Fights by John R. Hale. Chapter 5. Lepanto, 1571. Part 2. The 6 galleasses represented a new type, a link between the oared ships of the past and the sailing fleets of the immediate future. They were heavy, 3-masted ships, with rounded bows, and their upper works built with an inward curve, so that the width across the bulwarks amidships was less than that of the gun deck below. The frames of warships were built on these lines till after Nelson's days. This tumble home of the sides, as it was called, was adopted to bring the weight of the broadside guns nearer the center line of the ship, and so lessen the leverage and strain on her framework. The guns had first been fired over the bulwarks, but at a very early date portholes were adopted for them. The galleass had a high forecastle and poop, each with its battery of guns, pointing ahead, astern, and on each side. Other guns were mounted on the broadsides in the waist of the ship, and to command the main deck, in case an enemy's boarders got possession of it, lighter guns were mounted on swivels at the back of the forecastle and on the forepart of the poop. Compared to the low, crowded galley, the galleass was a roomy and much more seaworthy ship. She was generally a slow sailer, but in order to enable her to make some progress, even in calms or against a head wind, and so work with a fleet of galleys, she had a rower's deck, under her main or gun deck, and on each side 12 or 15 oars of enormous length, each worked by several men. She had the drawbacks of most compromises. She could not sail as well as the frigate, and her speed with the oar was much less than that of the galley. But the gain was that she could be used as a floating battery, carrying many more guns than the few pieces mounted in the galley's bows. The galleass's guns were high above the water, and the galleys dreaded their plunging fire. Each of Don Juan's 6 galleasses carried some 30 guns of various calibers, and to defend their high sides against an attack by boarders, their fighting men were chiefly arquebusiers. In order to fuse the triple fleet of the Allies into one armada, and to avoid the risk of international jealousies, Don Juan proceeded to form his galleys into 5 squadrons, each made up of ships selected from the 3 fleets, so that none of these divisions could claim to act only for Rome or Spain or Venice. The organization of the Christian armada may be thus summed up in tabular form. Division, Vanguard. Commander, Juan de Cardona. Galleys, 7. Main line of battle. Division, left wing. Commander, Agustina Barbarigo. Galleys, 53. Division, center. Commander, Don Juan de Austria. Galleys, 62. Division, right wing. Commander, Giovanni Andrea Doria. Galleys, 50. Division, reserve. Commander, Alvaro de Bazan, Marquis de Santa Cruz. Galleys, 30. Total galleys, 202. Sailing ships. Galleasses, 6. Frigates, 70. Total sailing ships, 76. These frigates sailed during the voyage as a separate squadron under Don Cesar de Avalos. They were employed as storeships and tenders. Total, 202 galleys plus 76 sailing ships, equals 278 ships in all. It is interesting to note that instead of choosing one of the large sailing vessels as his flagship, Don Juan displayed his flag, the standard of the League, from the masthead of the largest of the Spanish galleys, the Reale, a splendid ship built for the Viceroy of Catalonia 3 years before. She had 60 oars, a battery of guns pointing forward through a breastwork in the bow, and another gun on her high poop pointing over her stern, which was adorned with elaborate wood carvings, the work of Vasquez of Seville, one of the most famous sculptors of the day. She had a crew of 300 rowers and 400 fighting men. In the battle line 2 other great galleys were to lie to right and left of the Reale, on her starboard the flagship of Colonna, the papal admiral, and to port that of Veniero the Venetian, flying the lion banner of St. Mark. Next to these were the galleys of the princes of Parma and Urbino. On the extreme right of the center was the post of the flagship of the Knights of Malta, commanded by the Grand Master Giustiniani. All the galleys of the central squadron flew blue pennons as their distinguishing flag. The vanguard and the right flew green triangular flags. When the line was formed, Cardona and his 7 galleys were to take post on the left or inner flank of the right division. Doria, the Genoese admiral, was on the extreme right. The left flew yellow pennons. Its admiral was the Venetian Barbarigo, a veteran of many a hard-fought campaign. Santa Cruz, the admiral of the reserve squadron, was posted in the middle of his line, flying his flag on board the Capitana or flagship of the Neapolitan squadron. All the flagships had as a distinctive mark a long red pennon at the foremast head. 28,000 fighting men were embarked on the fleet. The Italian soldiers were the most numerous, then came the Spaniards. There were about 2,000 of other nationalities, chiefly Germans. The Venetian galleys were rather short of fighting men, and to remedy this weakness Veniero, though with some reluctance, consented to receive on board of them detachments of Don Juan's Spanish infantry. On almost every ship there were serving a number of young gentlemen volunteers. To give a list of their names and of the commanders of galleasses and galleys and detachments of troops embarked would be to draw up a roll of the historic names of Italy and Spain. Lepanto might well be described as not only the closing battle of crusading days, but the last battle of the age of chivalry. And, strange to say, on board of one of Colonna's galleys, acting as second in command of its fighting men, there was a young Spaniard who was to laugh Europe out of its chivalry, Don Miguel Cervantes Saavedra, author of Don Quixote, some 30 years later. At the end of the first week of September the fleet was ready for sea, but the start was delayed by bad weather. For several days a storm raged in the Straits of Messina, accompanied by thunder and lightning and torrents of rain. At length, on the 14th, the sky cleared and the sea went down. Next day Don Juan sent off the squadron of frigates under the command of Don Cesar de Avalos, with orders to proceed to Taranto and await the main body of the fleet there. At sunrise on the 16th the great fleet left Messina. The Reale led the way. The tall galleasses were towed out by the galleys. It took some hours for the whole armada to clear the harbour. Then, on the admiral's signal, they set their sails, and with wind and oar steered southwestward across the straits. The first day's voyage was only a few miles. Don Juan was taking the opportunity of reviewing his fleet, and testing his arrangements for its formation. Each captain had his written orders giving his position when under way and in the line of battle. It was in this formation the fleet anchored along the Italian coast beyond Reggio, on a front of 5 miles. Next day the fleet rounded Cape Spartivento, the toe of Italy, and after an attempt to continue the voyage on the 19th, was forced by bad weather to put back and anchor under shelter of the land for some 24 hours. As the weather improved, Don Juan decided not to coast round the Gulf by Taranto, but to lay his course from Cape Colonna for Cape Santa Maria, the heel of Italy, and then across the opening of the Adriatic to Corfu. A frigate was sent to inform de Avalos of the change of plans, and the armada, helped by a favouring wind, stood out to sea and for a while lost sight of land. It was known that the Turkish fleet had concentrated in or near the opening of the Gulf of Corinth. It might also have put to sea, and Don Juan took precautions in view of a possible encounter during his voyage. Cardona, with his 7 swift galleys of the vanguard, was directed to keep 20 miles ahead during the daytime, closing in to a distance of only 8 miles at sunset, and increasing the interval again at dawn. The 3 squadrons of the main body appear to have been formed each in line ahead, the leading ships, those of the admirals, at the head of each squadron, with such lateral intervals between the columns that line of battle could be formed by the ships coming up to right and left of their flagships. Santa Cruz with the reserve acted as a rear guard, and was to assist any vessel that might be in difficulties. The rear ship of each squadron was to display a large lantern at the masthead after dark. The admiral's ship was distinguished by 3 large lanterns. 40 galleys were detached to bring reinforcements of infantry from Taranto and Gallipoli. 4 swift galleys under the command of Gil de Andrada were sent on in advance to obtain information of the Ottoman fleet. From Cape Santa Maria the course was set for the Ionian Islands. On the morning of 24 September, through the driving rain that accompanied a heavy thunderstorm, the lookouts of the vanguard could distinguish the chain of islands north of Corfu, the islets of Merlera, Fano, and Samothraki, which with the reefs that almost connect them form a natural breakwater. The wind and sea were rising, and the fleet anchored inside the shelter of the islands and reefs. It was not until 26 September that it reached at length the harbour of Corfu. It had taken 10 days to complete a passage that the tourist from Messina to Corfu now covers in a single day. At Corfu the commandant of the fortress had terrible tales to tell of Ulugh Ali's raid on the island and the horrors that the Turks had perpetrated in the villages, which now presented a scene of ruin and desolation. Gil d'Andrada rejoined the fleet there. He had not seen the Turkish armament, but he had obtained news of it from coasters and fishermen. He estimated from these reports that it was inferior in numbers to the Christian fleet, and he had learned that, as if conscious of its weakness, it had taken shelter well up the Gulf of Corinth, in the Bay of Lepanto. The bay lies eastward of the point where the gulf contracts into a narrow strait between the castles of Roumelia and the Morea, then held by the Turks. The defences were of such strength that at the time the strait was popularly known as the Little Dardanelles. It was thought that it would be hopeless for the Allied fleet to attempt to force the passage. 4 days were spent in the waters of Corfu, and 4,000 troops of the garrison were embarked. Gil d'Andrada's 4 galleys had again been sent away to reconnoitre the enemy. On 30 September the weather was fine and the wind favourable, so Don Juan led his fleet from Corfu to the Bay of Gomenizza, 30 miles to the southeast, on the coast of Albania. The galleasses guarded the entrance of the bay. The galleys were moored inside it, bow on to the shore, with their guns thus directed towards it. Working parties were landed under their protection to obtain supplies of wood and water. On 2 October some Spaniards engaged in the work were surprised and made prisoners by Turkish irregulars, Albanian horsemen, who carried them off to the headquarters of Ali Pasha, the Turkish generalissimo, at Lepanto. Gil d'Andrada rejoined at Gomenizza with news that the Turkish fleet was not more than 200 strong, that pestilence had broken out among its fighting men, and that many of the galleys were undermanned. This encouraged Don Juan to attempt an attack upon it as they lay in the Gulf. But Ali Pasha had also received reports that led him to underrate the strength of the Christian armada, and so induced him to put out to sea in search of it. Twice he had reconnoitred the allied fleet. Before Don Juan arrived at Messina, Ulugh Ali had sent one of his corsairs, Caracoja, to cruise in Sicilian waters. The corsair painted every part of his ship a dead black, and one dark night, under black sails, he slipped into Messina harbour. The utter daring of his enterprise assisted him. Gliding like a ghost about the roadstead, unmarked and unchallenged, he counted galleys, galleasses, and frigates, and brought back an underestimate of the allied strength, only because the fleet was not yet all assembled. He repeated his exploit while the fleet lay in the waters of Corfu. He could not approach so closely as at Messina, but what he saw led him to believe it was no stronger than when he first reconnoitred it. When Ali Pasha questioned the prisoners taken at Gomenizza, using torture to make them answer him, he thought their admissions confirmed Caracoja's reports. So he decided to come out of Lepanto and attack the allied armada. Thus each fleet believed the other to be inferior in strength, and consequently desired an early engagement. The Turkish fleet was made up of 210 galleys and 64 galliots and smaller craft, 274 sail in all, and its commander, Ali Pasha, was one of the veteran admirals of Suleiman's victorious days. 25,000 soldiers had been embarked under the Seraskier, or general, Pertev Pasha. Ali had organized his fleet in 4 divisions: center, right wing, left wing, and reserve. All the ships had oars as well as sails, and though Ali had no huge floating batteries, like the 6 galleasses of Don Juan's fleet, the Turkish admiral could match the Christians with galley for galley, and have a surplus of 8 galleys and 66 smaller craft. Of these the 44 galliots were almost as useful as the galleys. Unlike the latter, which had 2 and often 3 masts, the galliot had only 1 and was smaller in size. But the Turkish galliots, mostly belonging to the piratical states of North Africa, were as large as many of the Christian galleys of the second class. They could sail well, and they were manned by crews of fighting men that had a long record of piratical warfare. The organization of Ali's fleet was: Main line of battle. Division, right wing. galleys 54, galliots 2, total 56. Division Center, galleys 87, galliots 8, total 95. Division Left Wing, galleys 61, galliots 32, total 93. Division Reserve, galleys 8, galliots 2, smaller craft 20, total 30. Totals: 210 galleys, 44 galliots, 20 smaller craft, total 274. The 50 galleys of the right wing were ships from Egypt, the ports of Asia Minor, and the arsenal of Constantinople, united under the command of Mohammed Chuluk Bey, governor of Alexandria, known among the Christian sailors of the Mediterranean as Mohammed Shirako. The center, commanded by Ali in person, was made up of galleys from Rhodes and the Greek islands, and from Constantinople and Gallipoli, and the Tripolitan squadron under Jafir Aga, governor of Tripoli. The left under Ulugh Ali, the viceroy of Algiers, included ships from Constantinople, Asia Minor, Syria, and the ports of northwest Africa. The reserve, chiefly composed of small craft, was under the command of Murad Dragut of Constantinople. There were a good many Greek and Calabrese renegades among the captains of the galleys, but the Syrians and the mixed Arab race of Alexandria had learned the ways of the sea. Some even of the Turks were good sailors, and the men of Tripoli, Tunis, and Algiers had made the sea their element. The thousands of rowers, who provided the propelling power of the galleys, were for the most part Christian slaves, chained to their heavy oars, by which they slept when the fleet anchored, living a life of weary labor, often half starved, always badly clothed, so that they suffered from cold and wet. Death was the immediate penalty of any show of insubordination, and the whip of their taskmasters kept them to their work. There were men of all classes among them, sailors taken from prizes, passengers who had the bad luck to be on board captured ships, fishermen and tillers of the soil carried off in coast raids. They were short-lived, for their masters did not spare them, and considered it a more economic policy to work the rowers to the utmost and replace them by other captures when they broke down. The oarsmen of the allied fleet had also a hard lot, but not as bad as that of Ali Pasha's galley slaves, because in the Christian fleet there was a considerable proportion of men hired for the campaign. But there was also a servile element, Turks taken prisoner in previous campaigns and chained to the oar in reprisal for the treatment of Christian captives by Ottoman commanders, and a considerable number of what we should now call convicts sentenced to hard labor, a rough lot of murderers, brigands, thieves, and the like. It must be remembered that in most European countries the sentence for such offences would have been death. The convict galley slaves of Don Juan's fleet were encouraged by the prospect of winning either complete pardon or a remission of part of their sentences if there was a victory, and to enable them to cooperate in winning it, they were told that they would be freed from their chains and armed when the day of battle came. The 25,000 fighting men of Ali Pasha's fleet were chiefly militia. There were only a few thousand of the formidable Janissaries, and among the small arms of the Turkish fleet there were more bows and arrows than muskets. Don Juan had, on the other hand, a considerable number of arquebusiers on his ships. He had the further advantage that while even the largest of the Turkish galleys had only low bulwarks, the galleys of the allied fleet were provided with pavesades, large bucklers and shields, to be fitted among the bulwarks when clearing for action, and also permanent cross barriers to prevent a raking fire fore and aft. When Ali left the roadstead of Lepanto and brought his fleet out from behind the batteries of the Little Dardanelles, he believed he had such a marked superiority over the allied fleet that victory was a certainty, and he expected to find Don Juan either at Gomenizza or in the waters of the Ionian Islands. Pertev Pasha and several of the admirals had opposed Ali's decision, and had urged him either to remain at Lepanto or run out of the Gulf, round the Morea, and wait in the eastern seas for the campaign of next year. Their reason for this advice was that many of the fighting men were new levies unused to the sea, but Ali's self-confidence made him reject this prudent counsel. On 2 October, Don Juan had made up his mind to leave Gomenizza, enter the Gulf of Corinth, and risk an attack on the passage of the Little Dardanelles. Accordingly, in the afternoon, he gave orders that the fleet should prepare to sail at sunrise next day. During the long delay in the island waters belated news came that Famagusta had fallen on 18 August. And with the news there was a terrible story of the horrors that had followed the broken capitulation. The news was now 6 weeks old, and this meant that the whole of the enemy's fleet might be concentrated in the Gulf of Corinth. But after the disasters of Cyprus an attempt must be made to win a victory against all or any odds. At sunrise the armada streamed out of the Bay of Gomenizza and sped southwards with oar and sail. The Gulf of Arta was passed, and the admirals were reminded not of the far-off battle that saw the flight of the Egyptian queen and the epoch-making victory of Augustus Caesar, but of a sea fight in the same waters only a few years ago that had ended in dire disaster to the Christian arms. Then through the hours of darkness the fleet worked its way past the rock-bound shores of Santa Maura, whose cliffs glimmered in the moonlight. The roar of the breakers at their base warned the pilots to give them good sea room. In the grey of the morning the peaks and ridges of Ithaca and Cephalonia rose out of the haze upon the sea, and soon after sunrise the fleet was moving through the narrow strait between the islands. In the strait there were shelter and smooth water, but the wind was rising, backing from northwest to west, and raising a sea outside Cephalonia that sent a heavy swell sweeping round its southern point and into the opening of the Narrows. As the leading ships reached the mouth of the strait, Don Juan did not like the look of the weather, and decided to anchor in the Bay of Fiscardo, a large opening in the Cephalonian shore just inside the strait. For 2 days the fleet lay weather-bound in the bay. During one of these days of storm Caracoja, the Algerine, tried again to reconnoitre the fleet, but was driven off by the guard ships at the entrance of the strait. On 6 October the wind shifted to the east and the sea began to go down. Don Juan refused to wait any longer. The fleet put to sea, under bare masts, and rowing hard against the wind and through rough water, it worked its way slowly across to the sheltered waters on the mainland coast between it and the islands of Curzolari. Here the fleet anchored for the night, just outside the opening of the Gulf of Corinth. Not 20 miles away up the gulf lay the Turkish fleet, for Ali had brought it out of the Bay of Lepanto, and anchored in the Bay of Calydon. When the sun rose on the 7th, the wind was still contrary, blowing from the southeast. But at dawn the ships were under way, and moving slowly in long procession between the mainland and the islands that fringed the coast. There was a certain amount of straggling. It was difficult to keep the divisions closed up, and the tall galleasses especially felt the effect of the head wind, and some of the galleys had to assist them by towing. As the ships of the vanguard began to clear the channel between Oxia Island and Cape Scrofa, and the wide expanse of water at the entrance of the Gulf of Corinth opened before them, the lookouts reported several ships hull down on the horizon to the eastward, the sun shining on their white sails, that showed like flecks of cloud on the sea line. End of chapter 5, part 2.